Yeah, good morning, good evening, everyone. Professor Barry here. The topic this week is racial stratification. Yeah, it's a really, man, there's so much content to try to get through in a short amount of time. Kind of hit the highlights, provide kind of like, we're going to get into a little bit of history, a little bit of things, more contemporary social life, lay out some concepts, theories, ideas, perspectives, so we can better understand stratification, racial stratification. We went last week social stratification, so we're kind of getting into these spaces now where we're looking at relationships between the dominant group and subordinate groups. And this week is a focus on racial stratification. If you're interested in this topic area, this one, class, gender, there's a class, SOC 212, Sociology of Race, Class, Gender. It's a really powerful, interesting, informative class. I think students walk out of that class just much more critically aware in a very powerful, useful way of the past and the present and their own journey. So look for that down the road. Hey, before we get started, I'm going to mention a couple of these books during the lecture, but I'm just going to just real briefly mention a few of them here. This is written by a historian, Nell Irvin Painter, who, where's she from? Princeton University. The History of White People. It's a really interesting historical examination of the development of ideas about race, if we're talking about race, we're going to talk about whiteness as well. So historical foundations all the way to more recent kind of conceptions and ideas like the history. How do we come to define whiteness? This kind of gets us into a little bit about critical race theory, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Another book that I think is pretty interesting and useful is looking at this idea of how biological ideas of race are returning, or this idea of superiority among race. And that's a really interesting book too, as well as kind of getting into the biological conceptions of race, past and present. For those interested, this is a little bit more of a dry read, but it's about, basically, as it's described here, white by law, defining whiteness, looking at the legal system, looking at historically how whiteness is being defined by the court system. Critical race theory is kind of right in this space. This is a kind of like a work that dovetails a lot with critical race theory kind of ideas, which in general, critical race theory is trying to examine and look at the way in which race has influenced institutions and structures throughout American history and culture. And that's what critical race theory addresses. The legal system is one system to be able to that it examines. I'll mention this as the color of law in the lecture. I'll mention this, the color of the law. That's about housing, lending practices by the government, and how we created racially segregated communities, and the impact of that throughout time. This is a really powerful book as well. Kind of gives you a great example, illustration of institutional discrimination and the impact of that discrimination across generations. Here's this book's called There Goes My Everything. I think I picked this book up. I was at Central High School down in Little Rock, Arkansas. I was on a sabbatical, and I was kind of touring around the South, going to different historical sites, museums, and Central High School is where the Little Rock, where the desegregation and Eisenhower deployed military forces to help support students going to an integrated school. Anyway, I think I picked this book up when I was there, and I just was gripped by this book and this kind of approach that Jason Sokol takes on, and basically like looking at and examining and talking with whites, Southern whites during that time period, their thoughts and their ideas about race and integration. And he takes a very empathetic view, trying to understand, not trying to demonize, marginalize individuals from the South, but to try to understand what were the white Southerners' response to things that were going on during the civil rights era of the 1940s through the 1970s. And this last book here, interesting book story I mentioned, I believe, in the week number 3, Rising Out of Hatred, person who grows up in an environment of white nationalism and ends up going to a liberal arts college and starts to challenge or starts to think through the ideologies and beliefs that he's accepted and grown up with, and starts to recognize, the way that race has had a force or an influence throughout history and to the present. Okay, so Yeah, a lot to go through. We'll try to make this about it, within an hour, just try to get to try to address like some central points and information. So first thing that I kind of get into is that, this idea about race, historically identified race as these biological entities, that there are these biologically different races, that biology was determining not only the physical features of individuals, but of groups of people, but also behavior, things like, criminality, sexuality, intelligence, and different aspects of different groups' experiences. The recognition today is that race is not determined by biology, and we will get into that. We'll kind of I'll provide a lot of illustrations how race is not driven by biology, that race is a social construct, but it has impacts. So while it's a construct, it's arbitrary. It's built on ideas based in culture and social, the social world. It's real in the sense that we believe it's real. It's kind of the idea of the Thomas theorem. If you believe it's real in its consequences. So we act the world based on our perceptions of it. So if we see the world, if we see this idea that race is this thing that there's this biological underpinning of race, we'll start to believe this sort of true, even though we can recognize that race is a social construct. It has real consequences because society could be structured in a way that treats or understands race as these different distinct groups that are based on biological ideas. So it's not genetic, social construct, and we'll clarify that as we go along. I thought it'd be kind of interesting or useful to kind of situate Oregon and Central Oregon kind of in a perspective, looking at racial demographics in our area, in Oregon and in Central Oregon. So Oregon overall, 83% Oregonians are white. We have, looking at you can see the overall US comparison in gray and Oregon in orange or yellow. 2% African American, 5% Asian, American Indian 2%, Hispanic 10%, Native American, other Pacific Islander 0.6%. So we're largely a white space, right, in Oregon, and there's historical reasons for that had to do with exclusionary laws, but also the impact of that during mass migration of African Americans out of the South, going to different city centers, and reasons why African Americans largely didn't come to the Pacific Northwest, and when they did, they were lived in very segregated communities and areas. If you look at more close to home, look at Deschutes County, Jefferson, and Crook County, and it's kind of interesting to look at Jefferson County, Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook County, and look at the difference in terms of this is white alone. 94%. So Oregon is fairly white. Even Central Oregon is even more white in terms of racial composition. But there is diversity. So it's kind of like a little bit of a challenge to say, there's no diversity. It's not that there's no diversity in Central Oregon, right? There's diversity in Central Oregon. There are groups, there's ethnic groups, there's groups within our communities of Central Oregon, and it's important to recognize that, and these demographics are also changing and moving. Okay, so let's now move into like some content about sort of like laying out the ideas about biological ideas about race. These depictions, we see them through our contemporary filters and recognize the racist elements that are embedded in these images or these characterizations. It's easy to recognize this today, and I think if you kind of try to put kind of your mindset on, think back, maybe what it would have been like when scientists were creating these models of biological ideas about race, creating these sort of depictions. The majority numerically in the United States would not have disagreed with these images, would not have been able to see probably the racist elements in these. I think it's a statement to where we're at today, that we can recognize much more clearly that the racialized component or the racism that's built in biological ideas about race. So these ideas about the idea that there's biologically distinct races emerged at a certain time period in history. Ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, different communities, different civilizations, different collectives didn't have biological ideas about race. It's not that people didn't mark difference. It's not that there wasn't markers between in-groups and out-groups, but they were drawn in different ways. And there wasn't the use of science. This is kind of the key thing here, is that biological ideas about race come about with the rise and development of the Enlightenment, the age of reason, the age of science, the application of science into the world. And then now science is creating this idea about biological race. So it's important, I think, to recognize that, in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, different places, that they're marking differences between different groups of people. Sometimes that had to do with language, what we call maybe ethnic background, but it wasn't due to this sort of idea about biological race. And I don't think it's happen chance that these ideas of biological race are coming about during time periods, not only is it development and expansion of science, but also colonization, exploration, coming in contact with different people from around the world. Humans have been on the move for a long time, so some of that wasn't new, but now it's conquering territory, it's colonizing. So biological ideas about race kind of fit into this as well, because when you're, colonizing another place and its people, biological ideas about race help give justification for the acquisition of property and the treatment, subjugation of people from that community. So it can be a very powerful ideology and an explanation that justifies particular treatment of particular groups. Early ideas and early categories, when scientists were first creating these categories, Carl Linnaeus in the 1700s, one of the first to create this sort of taxonomy, take the ideas of biology, right? This is what's going on. Take these ideas of biology, apply them to the human world, start to create a taxonomy around ideas about race, create these categories. Some of the early categories identify that there's 4 racial groups in the world, and the 4 are listed here. You can see these sort of very animalistic depictions of Africans, of those, this sort of animal, the idea of animal, right, which is more biologically, more sort of fitting into the realm of biology, a separate species from the rest, from the majority. And so that, again, I think you recognize now we look at that and we can see that racism that's built within that. But at that time period, I think, there was a lot of, for the majority of people in culture and societies that were getting exposed to these biological ideas about race, they didn't challenge these notions. I mean, they were the dominant idea, the hegemonic idea of the time. And you can see, in this, this is a depiction I think is really interesting too, is that there's an evolutionary perspective that's going on here. You have this sort of this Greek, this Roman statuesque white at the top of this sort of hierarchy, evolutionary sort of viewpoint from chimpanzee to this enlightened species. I think it's kind of interesting too, noticing the depictions, of the skull. These depictions, they don't even match up. The skull and the actual head itself don't even match up. The rotation, these are fully on a side. This one's rotated. And it's these kind of interesting things that are going on. That's the subject of Stephen Jay Gould's work on the mismeasure of man, about how scientists were measuring these ideas about not only race, but also gender and class. And scientists were unconsciously fabricating their data to get to certain conclusions that they wanted to get to. And it's a fascinating book, the mismeasure of man. And the point to illustrate here is that something like this is that probably the scientists were not doing this consciously or deliberately. They're caught within the winds of time. They're their own reasons for these kind of creations, unconscious biases that they were bringing into their work. And you'd think that those ideas about biological ideas about race would be long, long gone, but they're still part within culture and society itself. This is a book that caused a lot of controversy in the 1980s called The Bell Curve. The arguments from these 2 authors, Herrnstein and Murray, were that there's a biological explanation in part for why African Americans are not as successful in terms of educational outcomes, wealth outcomes, income outcomes, and things like this. And what the Bell Curve was identifying is it has to do with biological factors, including influences on IQ and other things like that. The problem with, or the critique of work like that, is that it's removing, if you go back to our ideas of self-determinism, right? It's moving into this realm of biological determinism. It's saying, like in the Bell Curve, that the reasons for these disparities, these racial disparities, has to do with biological causes. And it's the biological causes that are driving that. And think about the consequences of that. One is that if it's due to biology, there's nothing to control. You can't control that through social mechanisms. So it prevents us or provides justification for not intervening to address structural inequalities that are going on within society and culture. So it's very much of like a blaming culture, blaming victim, or blaming groups, and blaming individuals for their own economic, social circumstances. And so race science, it comes back at certain time periods. There's a long history in the United States of this idea about biological notions of race, Western Europe as well. And sometimes we think about these biological ideas, like the origins of them and the institutions that help support these ideas of biological ideas about race were really powerful and strong. And there were institutions and organizations that in the United States that were doing a lot of work to help support these ideas of biological ideas of race. And I'll provide a little bit more historical examples in a little bit. So we can counter that with this idea of the social construction of race. So if we can go back to our idea of social constructionism, that any construct we have, gender is a construct, any way that we think about the world is based on socially constructed meaning. So race doesn't have any inherent meaning to it. Race is something that humans give meaning to. Any difference that we see, it's humans that are giving meaning to it. There's an objective world, we can see difference, but it's the meaning that we give it is that human social process. And then we view the world through the constructs that we create. This means or illustrates that even though race is a social construct, or or other aspects of things that we've defined are constructs, we see the world through those constructs, and therefore they're very real to us, even though they are constructs. So sometimes these constructs get very stable. They get incorporated within institutions, within culture. They become the dominant way of thinking and knowing. So if we kind of look at the idea of biological ideas of race, I mean, that was around 1700s, 1800s, into the 20th century, and it probably really wasn't until the 1960s where, like this book, Thomas, with Berger and Luckman, the social construction of reality, people started kind of doing more and more examination of the social construction of race, where that idea of the biological idea of race was deconstructed. And now we've reconstructed a more complex, I think more accurate for sure, a more in-depth examination of how we arrive at meanings about race. So language is an important part of this. Like, look at constructs around race. We're talking about constructs, we're talking about language, and language is a powerful thing, right? It's a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Language shapes reality. There's different degrees to which that happens, but language is also a reflection of culture and the values of culture. So with the social construction of reality, we pay attention to the language habits of the community, the language system of the community as well. Meanings can get so institutionalized that they become reality, like the taken for granted world. This becomes that part of like the strange and the familiar becomes really important. The stuff that we take for granted and don't ask questions about and think about. So because it becomes so institutionalized, we forget the things that are a construct. And so one goal is to take the strange and the familiar approach and start to examine things in a more critically, more aware, more objective fashion. Some meanings are arbitrary, but again, like I mentioned before, they're real because we act as if they were that way. The Thomas theorem, if you define it's that way, then we act based on our perception of the world, not actually how it is. While ideas of race are created by humans and are arbitrary and flexible, it doesn't mean that race doesn't exist in our perceptions or our imagination, our attitudes, or institutions within society itself. So that even though it's a construct, it could live and be housed in ourselves and within institutions within society itself. While we're all part of this larger community, groups are labeled, they're identified, right? They're viewed and labeled in different ways. And it's that process we're trying to understand, is the categorization of different groups in different ways, including the categorization of the dominant group, the categorization of whiteness. Some illustrations of like how race is a social construct. We can go to the US Census and how this is really, if you want to, you could look up on the internet and look up racial categories, US Census, historical, and you get these really interesting charts and diagrams of the different racial categories that have been used across time. And when like a certain racial category emerges in the census, when one disappears. I mean, it illustrates that there's an arbitrary nature to this. There's a contextual nature to these construction of these ideas of race. Ideas of race included in the questionnaire reflect a social definition of race recognized in the country, and not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. So the census recognizes that the categories that they're using, and this becomes important, that while it's arbitrary and it's a construct, sometimes it's important to measure that because we have institutions and we have realities that are built upon ideas of race. So therefore, we need to measure them so we can understand it, the impact of race in society itself. The census recognizes that racial categories are human creations. I think it's kind of interesting that, there's like, we call the color line in the United States, like there's a more strict color line in the United States. In Brazil, other countries around the world, there's much more called color gradient, much more infusion of other variables besides race. It's race and it's class, it's region, and it's other elements. There's not like this dichotomy, especially in the United States, between white and black, and making that distinction. And you can see here, like in Brazil, these different skin colors, I mean, marking different groups based on skin color. And it's much more of a complex system of organizing a world around ideas about race. I mean, I think that kind of illustrates too that race is a construct. It's tied to culture, it's tied to place, it's tied to history. There's another interesting book, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. If you're ever interested in these books as well, or any book, I mean, podcasts are a great way to get access to information as well. And there's some great podcasts with Isabel Wilkerson talking about caste. In this little write-up here, basically, she talks about during a talk she gave one time, one person came up to her afterwards, after the lecture, the idea that 6 million African Americans had to seek political asylum within the borders of their own country during the Great Migration in the United States, a history that she had not known of. So this person that is attending didn't know that history of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South. She talked with me afterward and said something that I've never forgotten, that startled me in its basic simplicity, but it was very profound. And she said, this person that was in the audience said, there's no Black people in Africa. And kind of think about that for a moment, is that Africans are not Black. They are of different communities, different ethnic groups. They're not Black. They're just themselves. They're humans on the land. This is how they know themselves. This is who they are. But they become Black when individuals come to the United States, or go to a different nation or a different country where they're being categorized in a different way. Again, I think that illustrates quite well this sort of idea of race as a social construct. In that book, White by Law, Hanny Lopez, I mean, it's a whole book sort of addressing how did the courts struggle with and deal with who gets to be able to be identified as being white. There's a long history, for example, like the Irish were not white for a period of time in American history and culture. The Germans were not. Like, who gets to enter into that space of being identified as being white? A couple of different examples of social construction of race. Race can become a master status. We can see that the ascribed nature, race is something that's ascribed to us, given at birth. Tiger Woods' multiracial background, part Caucasian, part Indian, part Black, part Asian. I think that he identified himself as Cablinasian at one time. It's a short little video about him talking about his multiple backgrounds, with some of the controversy that came out as a result of that as well. Colin Powell had mixed genealogy in terms of his background, but it oftentimes gets identified as an African-American leader. Ted Cruz is not. Like this idea that he's white. Ted Cruz is as mixed racial background as well. So it's like how we see individuals. Sometimes like individuals can be very complex in terms of their genealogical heritage and their racial identification. But in culture, it can get, especially dominant culture, can squeeze all those differences out. And rather than recognizing that multiracial background is narrowing it down into one dominant master status. And I think that's kind of a powerful thing to kind of examine and think about as well. Another example of social construction of race is this idea that Asians are a model minority, taking this sort of big umbrella of the Asian American community and failing to recognize with that there's a lot of variability among Asian Americans. So we can look at, median income of Asian Americans versus other groups, and Pacific Islanders versus other groups. So as a group, achieving economic success in comparison higher than all these other groups. But then if we break it down, we go, okay, let's take that group and move away from the sort of model minority and seeing that all Asian Americans are the same, and start going down the list and sort of seeing there's a lot of variability if certain groups are more financially, have earned more financial resources than others. And then it gets into the question of the history and the background and the reasons for that. These biological ideas of race got us into spaces in the United States of eugenics, this idea that to improve society through controlling its genes. The eugenics, U meaning good, and then genetics, genes, right? So it's the control and manipulation of the gene pool within a society to improve the overall social health of society itself. This is the idea of eugenics. So this led to all kinds of things like the involuntary sterilization of individuals, Native Americans, individuals of color. Class got into this space as well, individuals of a certain social class, certain regions of the country. We think oftentimes that this comes out of, and applied to maybe Nazi Germany. But man, it's deep within the United States as well as other countries. In Australia, there was a belief that when 3 generations of time, that if you could integrate or you could mix races, you could breed in whiteness within the Aboriginal community and transform individuals over generations into being a member of the dominant group. And these ideas about biological race. Edwin Black's book, War Against the Weak, is a really fascinating, powerful historical perspective on the eugenics movement. One of the centers of eugenics was in Cold Spring Harbor, New Jersey. It was an epicenter for a lot of this research. Kind of part of it is also, going back to Ellis Island, Statue of Liberty, the Immigration Center. So it was a collection site. It was also a site that was a real strong place for a lot of this research in eugenics. That led to laws in the United States to prevent the mixing of races, miscegenation. So creating laws around anti-miscegenation. There was called the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, that 2 races so divergent in their mental capabilities, their cultural differences, they can't even be in close contact with each other because that will sort of taint the dominant group, or taint, maybe both groups. So anti-miscegenation laws all the way until 1967 in the United States, the case of Loving versus Virginia. That court case of Loving versus Virginia ended any ban on interracial marriages in the United States. So that was until 1967. It's pretty powerful to kind of examine that. Because of these real strong biological ideas about race, there became a concern in the 1940s, 1950s, and to put this in context, 1940s, 1950s, World War II, another migration of African Americans out of the South, moving north, moving to where employment opportunities were, war industries. There was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the desegregation of public institutions. So now we're moving to more towards integration and racial integration and support for that. So during this time period, there becomes a sort of anxiety among some members of the dominant group within community and society itself about what happens if individuals can pass as white, that they have Black heritage, but they present and they pass as white. So here's a member, Walter Francis White of the NAACP. He passes white. Nita Horn, actress, passing as white. In a film, Elia Kazan's film called Pinky, and this is a mother and daughter. She is passing as white. She grows up in the South. She leaves the South, goes to the North. She trains as a nurse. I think, if I remember the story right, she leaves the South in order to train as a nurse. She goes to the North, goes to school. She falls in love when she goes up to the North. She falls in love with a white guy. She comes back home, brings him back home to the astonishment of her mother, as well as other community members. During the film, the daughter and boyfriend, they kissed each other during the film. When Elia Kazan, the filmmaker, was creating the cast for the film, he intentionally chose two white actors to play these roles, so it create less controversy. But the idea that there was a Black person and a white person kissing each other in the movies led to the banning of this film in a lot of different cities throughout the United States, including Marshall, Texas. The city of Marshall, Texas banned this film. It ended up being a court case going up to the state Supreme Courts of whether or not a city could ban the showing of this film. Individuals within the community felt that this film was inciting or promoting interracial relationships between whites and Blacks during that time period. The Carnegie Institute comes up with this diagram to help alleviate public anxieties around passing. There's some really peculiar things and real racist things that are going on in terms of these depictions. I won't go through all of them, but maybe we can talk about some of them. But the general idea is you have a white person, white man, a woman, mulatto, half white and half Black. Although you can kind of see in this depiction, it's like you start to raise questions already. The lack of femininity and feminine features. Here's a white woman, quite a comparison going on here. There's a lot going on here that if I were to go back to that earlier slide on the mismeasure of man, right? And I mentioned that those who are making these depictions at that time probably weren't doing this consciously. It was built on their unconscious biases that were going on. And I think you could probably say the same that was going on here is that the members at the Carnegie Institute were reproducing this based on their own conceptions. They weren't aware of their own conscious biases that they were bringing forward in terms of creating this particular chart. The idea is that these two individuals, they have 4 children each. There's this color gradient going on here, going from Black to passing for white. Eventually, like these two kids get together, or young adults, they have a child, they have a white baby. So it's alleviating the public's concerns that if you have a person, if a person can pass as white, they have sexual relations with somebody else who's white, they have a child, that baby will be white as well. A lot of the things that are kind of like interesting about this is like, just even the depictions of maybe about social class within here as well. This white man is a different level of status in this white man in terms of class status. Even the labeling boy Black, white boy, pretty changing those around. It's like, what's, why that distinction and why that difference, what's going on there. That's pretty wild. That's 1950s, this idea of concern about passing as white. And then another example of like the arbitrary nature, but something really powerful. This is like an example too of like how race gets coded within the legal system. There was a case of Susie Gilroy Phipps, Louisiana. She was applying for a visa, I believe it was. She applied for a visa and she needed her birth certificate. She grabbed her birth certificate, or she requested it. When she looked at her birth certificate, identified on her birth certificate that she was identified as Black. And she wanted to change that, or is colored, I guess is what it was on her birth certificate. She wanted to change it. The court said no, so she went through this process to try to get her racial designation changed. There was all this focus back in that time period and before about all these variations of Blackness. So if you had, I meant that woman mulatto, half white, half Black, there are categories like the octoroon, somebody who's 1/8. There's all these iterations, somebody who's 1/8, 1/16, 1/32. There was a different language, a different word to describe each of those different categories. Susie Gilroy Phipps, if you look at genealogically, 1/32, I put in quotation marks, of Black blood, of African history, of genealogy. 1/32 would be like, if you're looking at it from that lens. And she wasn't allowed to have that racial designation changed. The court system said, it was, even though it's subjective, it was recorded that way at her birth, given that particular time period. So they denied her motion. I think that really clearly illustrates the arbitrary nature of constructing these ideas about race. Okay, so race social construct. not based on biology. Understanding the history of that, the history of those categories, incredibly powerful and important. It's helpful to understand that history, to understand the present, to be mindful of like race is a social construct, but yet it's real because, because we see it that way and we act towards the world in that fashion, or it's built in our institutions that way. So there is a reality to it, to race, but it's separate from a notion of biological roots for actual different racial groups. So we can go through understanding structural inequality, and to get there, we have to kind of move through thinking about the individual to thinking about the system. So individual level things versus things that are structured within institutions in society. Institutions like education, healthcare, the legal system, other institutions that within society itself that have that racial ideas are incorporated within them, directly and indirectly. There's different racial implications or implications for different racial groups based on those institutional things that are going on. So a couple terms to define and just kind of address, separate out, is prejudice, which is more attitude, belief, cognitive, affective, and then you get into discrimination, which is actual behavior itself. Stereotypes is putting people into, is also a cognitive process of taking the complexity of the world, creating a stereotype around that complexity. People fit into with that, the belief that people fit within that stereotype, minimizing all those different variabilities that are there. So it's holding on to like a very limited sort of view and perspective, the stereotype of members of a particular group. But important to separate out the attitude from the behavior. So Merton created, you don't need to know the author of that, but Merton created this sort of idea that you can kind of look at a grid and say individuals can be prejudiced and discriminate, and he called that the active bigot. Somebody who they're aware of their prejudices, they act on them, so they have the attitude and the behavior. Individuals could also not be prejudiced and discriminate, and that's kind of a harder one to wrap one's head around. Somebody may be part of an institution, and there's ways that institutions operate that may discriminate against members of another organization or members of a different group. And so an individual may not be prejudiced themselves, but may discriminate against somebody else because of institutional things that are going on. So that is like something kind of interesting to kind of work with and think about, is that sometimes discrimination happens not because the individual actors within an institution have prejudicial ideas. They happen because the way the institutions are structured. And then there's this idea of the timid bigot, somebody who's prejudiced but doesn't discriminate. Could be they hold prejudicial attitudes, but they don't discriminate because there may be consequences if they do discriminate. So it's against, it's against the law to discriminate among certain, to discriminate. So if they're, hiring manager within an organization, they may not have a belief in a conviction. They may have belief in convictions that are very prejudicial, but they may not act upon them. And then you get this sort of idea of the all-weather liberal, somebody who's neither prejudiced nor discriminatory. So we kind of move to like a structural kind of analysis, and to get there, we have to talk about racism, define it, and then get into the institution. So I thought, ThoughtCo had this, a nice distinction. Like you have the dictionary definition, the belief that race accounts for differences in human character or ability, and that a particular race is superior to others. So that's like this idea of racism. It's a belief that race accounts for the differences in ability and why different groups are more or less superior. Sociologically, we kind of get a little bit more complex in terms of this and see that racism as a belief system, but it's more than just a belief system that individuals hold. It's an ideology that permeates society that prescribes status positions to different groups based on perceived differences. Races are not inherently unequal, but racism within society and ideology of racism makes it so, provides justification for it. Genetics and biology don't suggest and don't provide support for why there's racial inequality. Rather, it's racial discrimination embedded within society and individuals that lead to racism itself. Institutional racism is permeated through legislation, our institutions like education, public health, other institutions. It permeates society and our institutions. It's embedded within society itself. individuals, so it's the structure of society itself is where the issue lies and the problem lies. So if I go back to like the color of the law, that during this time period when there's redlining going on, drawing areas around cities and communities where people were not allowed to get housing loans, who was able to get a housing loan. Even in World War II, post-World War II, the GI Bill, African Americans who served during World War II did not have access to Federal Housing Authority loans, FHA loans. So they were denied access to loans in order to purchase a home. Those are all institutional things that have real implications. So that's, more that institutional level. Then we think about like racism as that ideology that permeates society itself. Anti-racism is challenging and opposing those the racism within society, both the ideologies as well as the practices. So it's not being neutral. It's actually engaging to try to dismantle that system of racism and change it. One thing I think it's really important to recognize is that privilege and domination, so the dominant group, the privileged group, and the subordinate group, those two are linked. They're not separate from each other, or they're separate from each other, but there's a relationship between both of them. That it's not possible to have a group with privilege unless there's a group with disadvantage. So institutional discrimination serves the interest of those members of the subordinate group, and there's that privilege is obtained through the disadvantage of other groups. And there's this redlining video is a really useful one. It's short, fairly short video, gives you the detailed information about redlining. This is like in the Kansas City area where I grew up for a period of time. There's an area within Kansas City, the country club, or Sevilla Square. It was modeled after Sevilla, Spain. It's a beautiful area in Kansas City. The country club district of driving down through there, J.C. Nichols was a developer. And when this area was being developed, I mean, it was exclusionary. I mean, only whites could live in that area. And you think about the property, like think about this for a moment, like property values, that even if you were wealthy or a wealthy person, a person of color who was wealthy, if they had access to be able to buy a home there, the home appreciation over a course of time and what that would mean for wealth acquisition for that particular family is really powerful. So things like this, institutional discrimination led to, in this case, with housing, our segregated communities that we live in that are there still today, remnants of that today, and impacts, long-term impacts in terms of like access to wealth. Homeownership. This is, I just like want to pull up some data on homeownership and look at it for different for whites, blacks, and members of the Latinx community. And it just like look, it's like 70, 40, 42 over time in terms of home ownership. Wish I could go back. I mean, I didn't go back and like look further. It'd be interesting to look at that. But I'm trying to get at and trying to illustrate here is that through home ownership is a powerful way people gain access to wealth. And that wealth has real implications. And if we see a wealth divide between different racial groups, we can link part of that back to housing. Then we get into housing discrimination. Then we get into like, okay, this is like an illustration of racism that's built within the structure of society itself. And it tends to move across time or be impacted by that. Another great example, I think, is looking at college admissions. Again, this idea of privilege and domination is linked. It's a structural level kind of component. Ideologies help support that. Remember the idea of meritocracy. If you work hard, for those who work the hardest, have the greatest skills and talents, those are the ones who are the most successful. These ideologies prevent us from looking at the realities. So it's not to say that merit doesn't matter, but there's a more complicated story. Also important to keep in mind that it's intersectional. It's not that privilege is the same for every person of the dominant group. Class matters, gender matters, sexual orientation, gender identity matter. So it's very intersectional in nature as well. And I think that's kind of important to keep in mind as we're talking about that in looking at elite college admissions, it's not that all white people had access to the elite college admissions. It's those who are probably middle class, upper class, who have greater access. I find it really interesting, like discussions about college admissions. There's a long history we won't go into here, but of looking at college admissions and whether race can be a factor in looking at, applicants for admissions. Statistics on college admissions really interesting. Harvard University acceptance rates of 4.5%. Most recent admission cycle, 2023, is 4.5% to get in. If you're a legacy student or an athlete, which benefits those in the majority group much more, 2014, 2019, 43% of white students admitted to Harvard were either legacies or recruited athletes. And it's one thing to talk about, like, well, do individuals of a racial minority group get advantage through admissions process? We're ignoring the question in this: to what extent and how does privilege operate in terms of college admissions? It's a different discussion. In a lot of ways, that discussion challenges the dominant group much more than a question about whether a group is being discriminated against. It's another question to ask: is a group getting more privilege that's well beyond a sense of merit? Some more maybe like real clear, or different examples of institutional discrimination, going back to voting laws, rules and regulations around voting. This was the state of Louisiana during a time period when, African Americans were being barred for institutional reasons. Institutional racism and discrimination was going on that prevented African Americans from voting. There was the Secretary of State who kind of supported these ideas, had individuals take this literacy test. And if you kind of look through these literacy tests, you kind of go, this is pretty absurd. Like, draw a line around the number or the letter of this sentence, draw a line under the last word of this line, cross out the longest line in this line, draw a line around the shortest word in this line, circle the first letter of the alphabet in this line, like these kind of things. It's arbitrary, has no bearing on a person's ability to vote or understanding the issues that are going on. It's also subjective. The person who's interpreting the person's written responses easily can deny a person that they gave the wrong answer to these questions. So it was embedded with institutions that allowed for accepted discrimination, the repressing of votes from particular, from African Americans, as well as others. FYI, like a terminology, if you ever heard grandfathered, a person got grandfathered, like a law happened, right? A person gets grandfathered, like a law passes, people who were previous generations that get grandfathered into it, they go underneath the old rules kind of thing. Well, that word grandfather comes about after the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction. Voting is opening up to before Jim Crow South, before segregation is really in full force. African Blacks are voting in the South as well as, the North. And there became concern among those in positions of power that Blacks should not be having the right to vote. And so put these laws in place, like the poll tax or the literacy test. Well, these also had an impact on whites. So a law came into place that said basically you can be grandfathered in. So if you had a grandfather who voted, that you can vote, even though there are these literacy tests, that you don't have to pass them, which that meant that if you were white, that you didn't have to pass the literacy test because you were grandfathered in. I think that's kind of just a powerful justification for maintaining this particular system of exclusion of people from the ability to vote. And we still have that concern today, like voter suppression, like what's going on now in our contemporary political landscape of, is it voter ID laws? Are they just there for security, or is there voter suppression going on? And there's a lot of stuff to unpack in that space. I think that a large body of evidence is that there's definitely political maneuvering going on that's suppressing the vote for members of particular communities. Here's some more information about like students and admissions, legacy rates, Harvard University, the regular rate versus the admission for those that are legacy status. And this little blurb on this short video on affirmative action provides a useful framework in like the history of affirmative action, of trying to address racial inequality or racial institutional racism within society, and where that came from, and the power and the importance of affirmative action. All right, next topic, sort of move into ideas about whiteness. we all have, like, just like with gender identity, we all have a gender identity. I think that's more maybe clear, more obvious for those members of the dominant group. That if you're the dominant group in terms of gender, male, males have a gender identity. I think most males recognize ideas about masculinity. I think what's harder sometimes is members of the dominant group to recognize racial identity. So we all have a racial identity. Members of the dominant group, members of the subordinate group, but there are differences in terms of that racial identity development and ideas around race itself. That's why this idea of whiteness question mark, it's like, okay, how do we understand whiteness? Whiteness is an identity, but sometimes individuals of that group don't see that they have a racial identity. I think this is kind of, it gets the point a little bit, this Pew Research study, individuals to see themselves more, that do they see themselves of having a racial identity, or that race or ethnicity is an important part of their identity. And for members of minority groups, much more likely to see themselves of having that racial identity is an important part. And I think that's interesting, because I think in a lot of ways that whiteness can be of great advantage, if I were to go back to like looking at this, but it's less visible. And in a lot of ways, that the members of the dominant group some don't recognize the way in which race plays a factor or a role in their life. So if I go back to like the sociological imagination, or go back to other terms and concepts of understanding our own journey, like self-determinism, part of like thinking ourselves as self-determinative, we all have a racial identity. Members of the dominant group trying to understand how they achieve their racial identity is an important part of understanding one's own history, journey, biography, and also to be able to recognize the ways in which they're self-determined, and that the way that race played a role in their own life. Characteristics of a minority group are things like this, that have characteristics, either cultural or physical, that are distinct from the majority group, perceived or real, an ascribed status. So the status is ascribed at birth, unequal treatment, and less social, economic, or political power. So you can kind of see like, well, that's why members of minority groups see that race is much more central to their identity, because it's more visible and more lived experience where race has played a factor in their life, or the lives of people and the lives of people that they know, with members of their own racial group. So there's a link again between like privilege and domination, just like there's a link between the minority group and dominant group. Again, recognizing too intersectionality, that we're talking about race in this case, but important to keep in mind that race, class, gender, other parts of our identity, actually they're interwoven. Sometimes one part of identity is more salient than another, but they're interlinked, they're intersectional. So I'm kind of getting into like white privilege, this idea that the whiteness of being a place of privilege, unpacking it, understanding it. Any privilege is an unearned advantage that can be seen both systematically, like it's within institutions, as well as individually felt. Then you get these interesting reactions to that, like, of trying to understand white privilege, where there's the backlash or response that recognizing white privilege is a form of racism itself. We'll talk about this as like colorblind racism. That'll come up here in a second. And then a more anti-racist position is that, if you remember the majority group, being silent about the way the race operates is a way of perpetuating the system. So complacency is complicit in reproducing that system. Racial identity for formation for the majority group and minority groups are distinct and different. Whites in the dominant group and people of color, all humans have a racial identity. And like I said, all humans within the context where race is defined as sort of these differences have an identity built around that. Members of the dominant group have a racial identity. Members of the subordinate group have a racial identity, but it's more distinct, as I mentioned before. The dominant group, it seemed like it's assumed that race is more neutral, in part because it's less visible. And maybe that comes from, one's lived experience doesn't see how race has played a role, hard to recognize, not quite as obvious, haven't been on the end of discrimination, but been on the end of privilege. And privilege may be more difficult to see and recognize. It may be also a reflection of how institutions respond to different groups. For the majority group, institutions are there to serve, support, and individuals are not, targeted or impacted by institutional things that are going on that are built on ideas of race. It could be unconscious and degrees of awareness about the way particular individuals think about racial identity and think about race privilege. This is another really powerful book too, Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility, about conversations with whites about race sometimes lead to a lot of defensiveness, reaction, minimizing, denying. This is why I think, like with critical race theory controversy in the recent year or so, that a lot of school boards have been confronted by a lot of community members saying that, these community members, predominantly white, saying that critical race theory is racist. I think that's, one way to interpret that is that that's a response to a lot of white fragility, is that rather than asking questions and understanding what critical race theory is, it's responding to something in a different way. It's a reflection of that white fragility. Let's move on now to like this idea of colorblind racism. Like this is where we're at much more so today. We have institutional racism. If we go back to like Jim Crow South, where segregation was institutionalized, that was much more overt. Racism today can be much more covert. This idea of like colorblind racism emerges. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's book, Racism Without Racists, was my kind of first introduction to this concept. I think this book came out in the early 1990s, maybe somewhere around there. It's a really interesting book. He's done a lot of research in this area of like, how people develop their ideas about race, hold on to these ideas of being colorblind, to be racist, to be engaging in racism and supporting it without being racist oneself. So a quote from him is more important. How do whites explain the contradiction between like the color blindness, their own color blindness, and the way that color impacts inequality in society? I contend that whites have developed powerful explanations for why there's structured inequality or why there's different outcomes for different groups. And that these explanations come from a new ideology that is not based on biology, like it's not like the biologically differences in these groups, but it's based on this idea of color blindness. So racism without racism, or with racism without racist. I think a great quote I always thought was really powerful for me in his writing was this idea that racism comes not from the heart of racists, but from the fact that dominant actors in a racialized system receive benefits at all levels, and it's difficult for them to recognize it. So it's moving it away, looking at it from like a bad person, these are bad individuals. Racism is coming from, people are the dominant group, members of the dominant group are moving through institutions and culture and life, and they hold on these ideas about being colorblind, not because they're racist in their heart, but because the ways of their experiences have shaped that particular view. So being colorblind helps to maintain privilege and systematic inequalities because it's ignoring those realities that are going on. The world, it'd be great if it was colorblind, maybe in some ways. In other ways, not, because it's important to recognize difference, to recognize our unique histories and background. But, looking at institutional level, like looking at job hires and things like that, where race was not as powerful of a factor, it'd be nice to be, to be moving closer to that direction. But we are not there. So color matters in terms of structures and institutions and societies. And then Bonilla Silva, goes out, identifies at the institutional level that racial outcomes are not the result of individuals or individuals alone, but their practices that are institutionalized or part of our structures. This is a great like colorblind racism comment. Affirmative action is a negative reaction. So affirmative action, the programs that are designed to help prevent discrimination, members of race, gender, other different aspects of a person's identity, that there's protection, so discrimination does not happen, more moving towards greater equitable treatment. So, comment like affirmative action is negative reaction, only racists consider race. I mean, that's a very colorblind kind of notion of ignoring the realities of race themselves. A couple of different examples too. I don't see color, which is impossible. Everybody, it's a physical thing. We all see color, but people tell me that I'm white, like that t-shirt, colorblind racism, really prominent there. Even like Proposition 54, this is I have a really short little thing on this, that Proposition 54 in California was an initiative that was started that basically said that the state government would no longer keep data on the race of individuals who applied for jobs, college admissions, anything had to do with state institutions would no longer keep track, because the belief was that by keeping track, reinforcing ideas about race. Well, the problem with there's a couple things. Like, where does that come from? It comes from a very particular political ideology and political position. The other part of that is that if you don't keep track and identify like the racial background of individuals who are applying for jobs, you'll never know if discrimination is going on. So that proposition may seem, the idea of being colorblind may seem like in some ways, wow, that would be great, beneficial. The reality is that ignores the way in which the world actually works. All right, cruising through our theories. We're gonna go through these a little bit fast. Maybe in class talk about them more. The functionalist perspective is probably the most limiting perspective, or doesn't have as, there's a lot of critique of the functionalist application to a lot of things, but one of them here, race, there's a limitation here too. Functionalism address belonging and connection, important part, group solidarity. So maybe part like looking from a functionalist lens that different racial groups, it's about identity, it's about belonging, connection. Groups tend to be, groups tend to be more of similar background, lifestyle experience. So race can be an important part in terms of group membership. The ideas that we have in race about race and society would come from a value consensus would be the idea. And this becomes the big limitation of this model. So that something like having segregation within society, race, like different public institutions for whites versus people of color, that a functionalist position would be that comes from a value consensus. There's, a huge limitation of that. There's a huge problem with that idea because it's ignoring the role of power and inequality of driving that. I bring up this book. I should go back for a second. Like, why are all Black kids sitting together in a cafeteria? Beverly Daniel Tatum, African-American scholar, psychologist, who talks about racial identity development for members of the majority group and different racial groups. And during the 1990s, there was a movement within educational K through 12 to try to break up like kids of the same racial background sitting together. So trying to like force kids to not sit with members of only their same racial group. And, there's a lot of seemingly maybe good intent, but problematic. The reason that kids are sitting together is because of their similar experiences they have within the institution. It's important for their own support. It's belonging, it's connection. It's important for individuals to be also sharing space together, for sure. Don't get me wrong, but also there's something about that connection and camaraderie of shared experience. So maybe a little bit, you can kind of go that functionalist perspective about that. Conflict theory gets us into inequity, power, racial, looking at racial institutions and racism within them, protecting, ideas about protecting power, protecting, opportunities and all these different kind of things. What word am I thinking of? Just kind of how white supremacy is just infused throughout culture and society itself. And conflict theory is going to be much more attuned to that and examining the role that race plays in ways that privileges and disadvantages. And we could look at different historical examples of that for sure to get there. One concept related to this is like scapegoating theory. Scapegoating theory is that a member of the subordinate group gets identified as the source of the problem. So the real problem gets ignored, but the subordinate group gets explained. I think you can see a lot of this. A classic example often has to do with immigration, that the reason, contemporary perspective, that the idea that individuals from Central America, South America, from Mexico are coming to the United States and taking our jobs, right? Our economies being really hammered by immigration, that immigrants are criminals, like this component. And it's scapegoating, putting the blame on a particular group and ignoring the larger root of the problem and things that are going on around it. So it's blaming the victim versus looking at, the realities of how society is structured. You go back, way back, and we modern day contemporary iterations of this. We can go back to, this is the Black Irish, this is the Chinese, 1800s. They're devouring Uncle Sam. Immigration's going on during that time period. The belief for nativists at that time period, for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were that America's being destroyed. So this is a theme and a narrative that's deeply rooted in our history and our culture. So conflict theory perspective, it'd be things like, well, white supremacy is embedded in our culture. Racist ideas are ideals and practices are part of our order. The way to change that is to understand it, to engage in it, to try to address it, and to eliminate it. Part of it may come from a competition among resources rather than working together to create a more democratic, small d, democratic and more equitable world. It's about competition for resources. So the group of privilege, trying to maintain privilege in ways maybe either consciously or unconsciously trying to make that happen. Part of conflict theory too is addressing how this links back to the economic structure of capitalism, how capitalism facilitates the accomplishment of that. Policies like stop and frisk, now viewed as now identified as unconstitutional, but certain things get embedded in terms of practices through institutions that reflect these ideas. And then finally, critical race. So, and part of this too, thinking about critical race theory, critical race theory is trying to provide, I would argue, or provide a perspective. Critical race theory is trying to provide a more rich understanding of history and seeing how race has been part of our history for a long period of time. And so the response to that is trying to remove it. And to me, that's about protecting power, or I should say from like a conflict theory position, that's about protecting power and protecting institutions. And then, just a couple different, I don't know, examples of, conflict theory, kind of this book I mentioned earlier, looking at from white Southerners, their responses and reactions to desegregation in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, places like Mississippi of removing the Confederate flag or flying a new flag, changing the symbol, because those symbols in the past were really powerful ideas of white supremacy built within them. And then interactionism is, about identity formation perspectives, meaning that we give things like the social construction of race, meaning and perspective, all those different kind of things. And then finally, cultural appropriation. So difference between appreciation, appropriation, appropriate. This short video gives you the background of what appropriation is. And the basic idea is taking from a culture, usually denying or not recognizing the unique history behind that cultural artifact or cultural component, bringing it in within dominant culture, usually for some economic gain, and usually not paying attention to the history of that particular practice, tradition, or object. And it's not about one thing, like the Winnebago or the football team, sports team, Sundance Film Festival. It's not about one thing. It's more about thinking about the collage or thinking about the larger kind of component that's going on, the patterns in society itself. Some of the more clear and obvious examples of appropriation are looking at the appropriation of Native American symbology practices into commodification, into products. Land O'Lakes recently moved away from this depiction. This was common when until fairly recently, and now removing this, this idea of the Native American being the caretaker of the land kind of component. I think it's more difficult to recognize things in the present versus the past. Like in the past, getting into things like blackface, the minstrels in the past, versus looking at contemporary society. It's easy to see the past and see that stuff, or they just recognize the appropriation. Present, we may get a little bit, because I think we get too attached to the way things are, and it's harder for us to have a beginner's mind and to see things more objectively. Again, it's not about the one product, but it's a broader analysis. There's some subjectivity, I would like to say, too. Determining what is appropriation and appreciation. But it's a powerful thing to kind of start to sort of think about, is that idea of taking from a culture for some economic or other gain, and devaluing kind of the origins, the meaning and the origins for the group where that came from. To me, it's like something about, economic world that we live in, as well as the power of the dominant group to be able to do that kind of work. All right, that's a lot. Well, I look forward to our discussion in class. Hope you have a great day, and see you in class.